The cistern she was lowered into for a week without food. A Lakota chief pulled her out at dawn. The rope was still there. That was the first thing I saw. It was tied to the iron ring they'd bolted into the stone lip years back, when the cistern was still being used, when somebody cared enough about this land to keep water on it. The rope was old, but it hadn't frayed. Whoever lowered her in had taken care with the knot. That detail bothered me more than the rope itself. Care in a cruelty like that, that says something about a man's patience, his certainty that he won't be caught. I had ridden out before first light because one of my younger men, Chayton, had spotted smoke the evening before. Not cookfire smoke, the thin, dying kind. He'd come to me and said it in the way young men report things they don't understand, flat words, no color, waiting for me to tell him what it meant. I told him we'd go look at dawn and sent him back to his fire. I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark and listened to the horses shift and thought about smoke that wasn't a cookfire on land nobody was supposed to be living on anymore. The cistern sat in a stone hollow about 200 yards east of what had been a homestead. The house itself was gone, roof fallen, walls scattered by weather and probably by hands, but the stone foundation remained, and the cistern remained, and the iron ring remained. I had passed this place 100 times and never looked at it closely because it was one of the many things on this land that had been built by people who came and then left or died, and looking closely at such things used to make me feel a particular kind of tired. I looked closely this time. The rope, the ring. I got down off my horse without saying anything to Chayton. I went to the edge and looked in. She was at the bottom. 12, maybe 14 feet down. The cistern was dry, had been dry for years, and she was sitting with her back against the curved stone wall and her knees pulled to her chest and her head down. I could see her hair, which was brown gone gray at the part, and I could see that she was breathing because her back moved. She was alive. I said something, I don't remember what. A word in Lakota, not thinking. Her head came up slowly, like a woman waking from a very deep place, and she looked up at me and I could see her face then, and it was the face of someone who had been in the dark alone for a long time and had stopped expecting anything from the light. I said, "Can you hold a rope?" She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "Yes." That was all. No crying, no shouting, no fear when she saw what I was. Just, yes. I have thought about that word many times since. The way a person stripped down to nothing has no room left for anything that isn't necessary. Her name was Nora Voss. She told me that 3 days later when she could sit up without shaking. Before that she told me almost nothing, not because she was afraid but because she was too weak and too far inside herself, and I didn't push her. I have lived long enough to know that a person who has nearly died needs to come back at their own pace, and that the worst thing you can do is pull too hard. She had been in the cistern for 7 days. 7 days without food. A trickle of water had seeped through the old stone, enough to keep her alive, barely. She had drunk it off the wall with her mouth pressed to the stone. She told me that later and didn't say it with shame or with the expectation that I would find it remarkable. She said it the way you say a thing that happened, nothing more. My camp was 3 miles from that hollow, in a stand of cottonwoods along the creek. I had 26 people with me, not my whole band, but the ones who had come with me to this section of the territory for the autumn, because the grazing was still good here, and I was not yet ready to move back north to the agency. The agent had sent word that I needed to report before the month was out. I was not yet ready to do that either. We brought her to camp on Chayton's horse because she couldn't ride alone. I sat behind her and held her up, and she didn't say anything about that either, just let herself be held. She smelled like stone and old water, and the particular smell of a body that has been very close to its end. My sister, Wachui, took one look at her and started moving. That was Wachui. She made decisions with her hands before her mouth opened. She had a bedroll down and a fire built up and broth on within the time it would take most people to ask what was needed. I have always respected that about her. I told Nora Voss she was going to stay with us while she got her strength back, and Nora Voss nodded once and lay down and was asleep before Wachui had the broth ready. I went and stood by my horse and looked east toward the hollow and thought about the rope and the knot. I should say what I was then, because it matters. My name is Lakota. I was given a longer name at birth, a name that meant something about thunder and distance, but Lakota was what people called me, what I had called myself since I was a young man, and it suited me better as I got older. Lakota means friend to everyone, which is a good joke on me because I am not naturally an easy man. I am patient, which is different. I can wait a long time for a thing, and I can be still a long time while it happens, but underneath that stillness I am watching everything and I am not gentle. I was 46 years old that autumn. I had been a war leader when I was young, in the years when there was still fighting to be done, and that word meant something. I had led men into situations that I would not describe to you now, and I had brought most of them back out, and the ones I didn't bring back I still carry. That is the weight a war leader takes on willingly and carries forever, and if you aren't willing to carry it, you have no business leading men into those situations in the first place. I had 3 men I couldn't bring home. I remember their faces more clearly than I remember some of my own children's faces at the same age, which is a thing I have never said out loud and would not say to anyone but you, here, now. When the fighting ended, when it ended in the way that it ended, which is to say not with anything like victory for us but with exhaustion and numbers and a particular grinding quality of impossibility, I became the kind of man who sat across tables instead. It was a different skill. A skill I was worse at, and the gap between how good I needed to be at it and how good I actually was had consequences that I also carry. By that autumn I was what the government documents called a chief, which was their word for a man they wanted to negotiate with, which was their word for a man they wanted to sign papers. I had signed papers. I had ridden to the agency and sat across tables from men in suits and listened to translations of what those men were saying, and the translations were always worse than the faces of the men, and the faces were already bad. The translator we used for the first several years was a Métis man named Beaumont who did his best but who I could see working at the edges of the language, trying to find the closest word for things that didn't have a closest word. And I learned to watch the gap between his face and the words he used, because that gap told me what was being lost. What was being lost was always the precision of the obligation, the specifics of what was promised, the language that would make a promise stick. I had signed papers and watched the land described in those papers shrink and change and be redrawn, year by year, until the land I had been promised for my people to live on bore almost no resemblance to the land I had originally been shown on a map. I had made arguments. I had made careful arguments, in rooms with men who nodded and wrote things down and told me my concerns were noted. Noting a concern and doing something about it are not the same, and I had learned that too. I understood what was happening. I had understood for a long time. Understanding a thing and being able to stop it are not the same, and I had learned to live in that gap between knowing and being able to do, which is the most wearing kind of knowledge there is. It wears you in a particular place, behind the sternum somewhere, a constant low pressure that you eventually stop noticing the way you stop noticing a bad knee. It's there. It's just always there. My wife had understood this about me, without my having to explain it. She had a way of sitting close on evenings when I came back from meetings with the agent's people, not talking, just close, her shoulder against my arm, her hands doing whatever work they were doing. That proximity was a thing she gave me, and I took it every time because I needed it, and because she knew I needed it, and because in a life with a lot of loss in it, being known in that small and wordless way by another person is not a small thing at all. She had been gone 8 years. The low pressure behind my sternum had 2 sources now, and they were not always easy to tell apart. So that autumn I was a man with 26 people in my care. in a camp in the cottonwoods, on land that might or might not still be ours depending on which paper you consulted, with an agent's deadline at the end of the month, and a woman I'd pulled out of a cistern sleeping in my sister's bedroll. I was tired. I had been tired for years, not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, the other kind. Nora Voss ate a little on the first day and more on the second. By the third day she was sitting up and holding a cup with both hands and looking at things with eyes that were fully in the room, which is the sign I always watch for. When the eyes are fully in the room, a person has come back. Wachui sat with her. They didn't share a language, and for the first day they sat in silence, but Wachui was the sort of woman who could make silence feel like company, and apparently Nora Voss was the sort of woman who appreciated that, because she relaxed into it. I watched them from across the camp sometimes, the two of them sitting by the small fire, and it looked like two women who had known each other a long time and had nothing left that needed saying. I spoke to Nora on the third day, sat down across from her and let her talk when she was ready. What she told me was this. Her husband, Martin Voss, had been a government surveyor. He had come into this territory 2 years earlier to survey a particular section that the railroad wanted to acquire, and in the course of doing that work he had found a discrepancy, a piece of land, about 400 acres in the northeastern corner of the survey, that according to the original treaty still belonged to the Lakota but had been quietly removed from the most recent agency maps. He had documented it. He had written a report. He had sent a copy of the report to the Federal Land Office in Washington and kept a copy for himself. 3 months later he was dead. His horse threw him on a trail he had ridden 100 times. That was the official account. Nora Voss did not believe the official account. She had her husband's copy of the report, and she intended to take it to Washington herself and deliver it by hand. And 2 weeks ago she had been traveling through this territory on her way east when 3 men had stopped her wagon on the road, taken the wagon and the horses and her bag, which did not have the report in it, because she had sewn the report into the lining of her coat, and driven her out to the old homestead and lowered her into the cistern. She said all of this in a plain, careful voice. She was not asking for my sympathy. She was telling me the facts so that I would understand the situation. I sat with it for a moment. Then I said, the 400 acres. She looked at me, yes. Show me on a map where it is. She hesitated. Not because she didn't trust me, I think, but because she was reassessing something. Then she reached inside her coat and brought out a folded piece of paper, worn smooth at the creases, and opened it on her knee and showed me. I looked at the map. I knew the land. Of course I knew the land. I had walked on it, ridden on it, grazed horses on it, watched the light fall on it in every season for 40 years. And I knew that the northeastern corner of that map corresponded exactly to the section they had taken from us 4 years ago in the last round of revisions, which the agent had told me was a boundary error corrected in our favor, which had not felt like a boundary error corrected in our favor, but which I had not been able to prove anything different about. I sat looking at that map for a long time. Then I said, who were the 3 men? She said one name. That was enough. It was a name I knew, a land agent who worked out of Silver City, 60 miles south, who had been involved in each round of those revisions, who had shaken my hand at a table and looked me in the eye while agreeing to terms he had apparently already arranged to undercut. I folded the map very carefully and gave it back to her. I said, rest another day, then we need to talk about what happens next. What happened next took me 4 days to decide. Not because I didn't know what should happen, I knew what should happen, but because I had 26 people in my care, and anything I did had consequences for them, and that was the weight I had carried for so long that it had become a part of my posture, the thing that kept me from standing fully straight. I am going to tell you what I did. I am going to tell you plainly without dressing it up. I sent Chayton to the agency with a letter for the agent, not a compliant letter, not an apologetic one. A letter that said I was in possession of testimony and documentary evidence relating to the fraudulent reallocation of 400 acres of treaty land, that the woman who carried this evidence had been imprisoned without food for 7 days by men connected to a federal land agent named in the document, and that I intended to escort her safely to the federal land office myself. I said that if anyone attempted to intercept us on the road, I would consider it an act of hostile intent and respond accordingly, and that if the agent had concerns about this plan, he was welcome to ride out and discuss them with me in person. I had not written a letter like that in years. I had spent years writing careful letters, measured letters, letters that found the language that would not give anyone a reason to act against my people. I was very tired of writing those letters. The agent did not ride out. He sent a reply that said he acknowledged my communication and was looking into the matter. That was all. It was the reply of a man buying time, and I knew it, and I let it go because I didn't need his permission. I also sent 2 of my men, Hekshila and his brother Mado, to watch the road south of the homestead site, not to confront anyone, to watch and to report. They came back on the 2nd day and told me that 3 men had ridden out to the cistern and found it empty, and that those 3 men had then ridden south fast towards Silver City. So they knew she was alive, and they knew someone had her. I told Nora Voss what I'd found out. She was sitting outside by then in the sun. She had color back in her face, and she was eating properly, and she looked like someone different from the woman I'd pulled out of that hole, or maybe like the same woman with more of herself present. She listened to what I said and nodded. Then she said, "How many days to the land office in Cheyenne?" I said 10 days riding, longer by wagon. She said, "I can ride." I believed her. She had a quality about her that I was coming to recognize. She said things because they were true, not to impress anyone or to manage how she looked. I had met very few people like that in my life, white or Lakota. I said, "I'll take you. I'll bring 4 men." She looked at me for a moment. "Why would you do that?" It was a real question, not suspicious, just real. She wanted to know. I thought about how to answer it. I could have said it was because of the 400 acres, and that was true, and it was part of it. I could have said it was because the men who put her in that hole needed to face a consequence, and that was true too. But there was something more than that, something I was only working out as I sat there in the sun across from her. I said, "Because it's the right thing to do, and I have not done enough right things in the past few years." She looked at me for another moment. Then she nodded, the way she'd nodded at everything since I pulled her out of that hole, not with surprise, just with the acknowledgement that this was a thing that was real, and that we would proceed accordingly. She said, "All right." We left before dawn on the 5th day. Chayton and Hekshila and Mado rode with us, and a 4th man, an older warrior named Sunkawakin, who didn't talk much but who I trusted more than almost anyone alive. He was 58 years old and had ridden with me since before I was a war leader, and there was a quality in him I had relied on for so long I no longer thought about it consciously, the way you stop thinking about the weight of a coat you wear every day. He read country the way most men read faces. Wachui gave Nora Voss her 2nd-best pair of riding moccasins because Nora's boots were in poor shape, and Nora looked down at them for a moment before she put them on, and I saw something move across her face that she didn't put into words. She looked at Wachui, and Wachui looked back at her with that expression of hers that was not warmth exactly, but was something close to it from the outside. And Nora said in English, something low that I didn't catch, and Wachui nodded once. That was enough for both of them. I said my farewells to the camp in the usual way, a few words with the older men, a look at the horses, a stop by the fire where 2 of the children were already awake, and watching us prepare to leave with the large dark eyes of children who understand that when the adults leave with that kind of preparation, it means something serious. I had 3 grandchildren of my own, back at the main camp, and one of them had that exact same look. I thought about them for a moment, and then I put the thinking away, because where I was going required my full attention, and dividing it would not help anyone. We rode out into the dark with the stars still out, and the air cold enough to see breath from the horses. The first 2 days, we made good time and saw no one. The country south of the cottonwoods was open grassland, rolling, easy to watch in all directions. I kept Hickshilla and Motto out on the flanks, far enough apart that if someone wanted to approach us, they'd have to cross open ground on at least one side, and I watched the line of the horizon the same way I'd watched horizons for 30 years. Nothing. On the first evening, I found myself almost disappointed by the nothing, which told me something about where I was in myself, that the prospect of a conflict to meet directly felt better than the slow attrition of the past few years. That is not a healthy place to be in, but it was an honest place, and I noted it without judging it and let it go. On the third day we came into broken country, draws and gullies, cedar breaks, places where a man could wait. I moved us slower and sent Sunka whacking ahead. He found them in a dry wash. 2 men with horses waiting. He came back and told me, and I sat on my horse and thought about it and looked at Nora Voss. She was watching me. I said, there are 2 men in that wash ahead. I think they were told to stop us. She said, what do you want to do? I said, I want to go around. But if we go around, they follow us, and we spend the next 7 days looking over our shoulders. She said, then we don't go around. I looked at her, you're sure? She said, Lakota, they lowered me into a hole. I sat in the dark for 7 days. I drank water off a stone wall. I watched one woman I'll probably never see again give me her moccasins because mine were falling apart. She stopped. Her voice was even and her eyes were clear. I am very sure. I turned to my men. I told them what we were going to do. We came at that wash from 3 sides. I will not make it more than it was. There were 2 men and 5 of us in the element of surprise, and it was over quickly and no one died. The 2 men had their weapons taken and their horses taken, and they were left on foot in the broken country with enough water to reach the nearest settlement if they walked without stopping. I thought that was fair. They had given Nora Voss less than that. We camped that night in a cedar break and I sat by the fire, and for the first time in a long time I didn't feel tired. Not rested, exactly. I wasn't rested. We still had 7 days to Cheyenne, and the land agent in Silver City knew roughly where we were, and there would be more to deal with when we got there. But the tired was different. The specific worn-through quality of it that I'd been carrying was quieter. Nora Voss sat across the fire from me. She had a blanket around her shoulders and she was looking into the fire, and after a while she said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. She said, "The letter you sent to the agent, the one that said you'd respond accordingly if anyone tried to intercept us." I said yes. She said, "Did you mean it?" I said yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I thought so. That's why you sent it, because if you'd sent a careful letter, they'd have known you were still playing by their rules. A careful letter would have bought them time to plan." I looked at her across the fire. She said, "My husband used to say that the most dangerous thing you can do to a man who expects you to stay in a particular lane is step out of it." I said, "Your husband was right." She nodded. "He usually was." She looked back into the fire. "That's partly why they killed him." We sat with that for a while. I put another piece of wood on the fire. She said, "Tell me about the 400 acres. So I did. I told her what that land had been, the way the cottonwoods ran along the creek in the north section, the way a particular ridge caught the last light in autumn, a spring-fed pool that never ran dry even in the worst summers, the names we had for places that were now on government maps with other names or with no names at all. I told her what it had meant to be told it was still ours, and what it had felt like when that turned out to mean something different than I'd been given to understand. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When I was done, she said, "When we get to Cheyenne, my husband's report documents the original treaty allocation and the specific section removed. With your testimony about what was represented to you versus what was actually done, that's a record." I said, "A record isn't land." She said, "No, but it's a start. And the man in Silver City is named in the report by connection. That's his problem now, not yours." I thought about that. She said, "I know it's not enough." I said, "No." She said, "I know." That was all she said. She didn't try to make it better than it was or tell me something would change. She just said, "I know." And that was, somehow, more than most people had given me in a long time. The acknowledgement without the performance of comfort. 7 more days. The country changed as we moved south and east, grass giving way to scrub to more open stretches where the land was pale and the sky felt very close. I had not been in this part of the territory in years, and the distances felt different than I remembered, wider somehow, the landmarks farther apart. There is something that happens to a man's sense of distance when he has spent years on shrinking land. Everything beyond a certain boundary starts to feel slightly unreal, slightly unmapped, as if the world stops being the world he fully belongs to past a certain line. I noticed that feeling, and I noticed myself noticing it, and I filed it away as something to think about later. Nora Voss rode well. She had ridden before. She had a way of moving with the horse rather than against it, a horse person's patience with the animal's rhythm. And after the first day she needed no attention from me. She rode mostly in silence, which suited me. Sometimes she spoke to Wachui's moccasins, which sounds like a strange thing but isn't. She'd look down at them on her feet, and her expression would do something, and you could see her remembering where they came from, who had given them. On the 4th day out from the cedar break, we came over a low rise and the country opened suddenly to the east, and you could see for maybe 40 miles. A great flat pan of pale grass, with the sky coming down to meet it at a line so clean it looked drawn. We all stopped without deciding to. Even the horses stopped. Mato said something in Lakota about the distance, and Haxilla answered him, and they were quiet again. Sunka Wacken had been at this sort of view before and simply adjusted his seat and waited for the rest of us to finish with it. Nora Voss said, softly, not really to anyone, "Lord." I looked at the distance for another moment. Then I said to her, "My grandfather told me that when he was a boy this whole country looked like this. Every direction, as far as you could ride." She turned and looked at me. "How long ago was that?" I said, 60 years roughly. She looked back at the flat pan of grass. She said, 60 years. I said, yes. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Martin always said that the thing people get wrong about the West is they think it's about land. He said it's about time. 60 years ago this was one world. Now it's something else. The land's still there, but what it means is different." She paused. "He meant it as something hopeful, I think, that things could change again." I said, "He had more faith than I do." She said, "He did, that was part of him." She pulled her horse around to face east again. "It was also the thing that got him killed." We rode on. Chayton rode beside me one afternoon and asked me something in Lakota, whether I thought this journey would change anything, whether the paper in her coat would do what we hoped. I said I didn't know. He said, and this was a young man, 19 years old, a man who had grown up in a world already changed from the one I'd grown up in. He said that he thought it mattered anyway, that doing the right thing mattered even when you didn't know if it would work. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said that he was probably right, and that if he was smart he'd hold on to that belief as long as he could, because the world worked hard to take it from you. He said he'd try. He was a good young man. His father had been one of the 3 men I didn't bring home. I had not told him that, and I would not tell him, because knowing it would not help him, and because what I owed his father was not something I could pay to the son. It wasn't transferable, that kind of debt. What I could do was take the boy with me on a ride like this one, and let him see a man try to do a right thing in a situation where doing nothing would have been easier. That was the only version of the debt I could settle. We came into Cheyenne on a cold morning, clouds flat and low, the kind of sky that carries weather behind it. The city was louder and more built up than the last time I'd been through, more buildings, more wagons, more people moving with the quick, purposeful walk of people who have places to go and money moving around them. We drew looks. We always drew looks. I had learned over many years to ride through looks without showing I'd seen them. What people thought of me in the street was not information I needed. Nora Voss knew the address of the Federal Land Office. She had memorized it. We found it on a street 2 blocks from the main thoroughfare, a plain brick building with a wooden sign, nothing that looked like it could contain something important. Most important things are in plain buildings. I tied my horse and turned to my men and told them to wait outside. Chayton looked like he wanted to argue. I told him there was nothing to argue about and he settled. I went in with Nora Voss. The office was not large. A clerk at the front desk looked up at us with the particular expression of a man managing his reaction and doing it poorly. Nora Voss asked for the senior land commissioner in a voice that did not give the clerk room to deliberate, and after a moment he went through a back door and we waited. I stood still. I had learned to stand still in rooms like this, not submissive, not aggressive, just present, taking up the space I was taking up and not pretending to be smaller than I was. It is a specific skill, learned over time. It is perhaps the only skill I am truly proud of. The commissioner was a man named Aldrich, 50-ish, with the tired eyes of someone who dealt with difficult things all day. He came out and looked at us, and I watched him make decisions about us based on what he saw, and then I watched him decide to set those decisions aside, which told me something about him. He said, "You wanted to see me?" Nora Voss said, "Yes." She reached inside her coat and removed the report and placed it on the clerk's desk. "This is a copy of a survey report prepared by my husband, Martin Voss, 2 years ago. The original was submitted to this office and either misfiled or suppressed. I don't know which. The report documents a fraudulent reallocation of treaty land. It also documents the individuals responsible." She paused. "My husband died before he could follow up. I was imprisoned in a cistern on that land for 7 days and left there to die by men connected to one of those individuals." She said the land agent's name. "I have testimony to accompany the report." Aldrich looked at her, then he looked at me. I said, "I am Lakota. The land in that report is land my people were told remained ours. We were told this at a formal meeting with your agency's representative. What was actually done was different. I can describe in detail what we were told when, by whom, and what was then done in contradiction to it." Aldrich said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Come into my office." We were in that office for 2 hours. I will not tell you what was said in full because some of it was technical, the kind of language that land disputes run on, terms and references that I had learned more of than I ever wanted to know. Nora Voss was precise and careful and gave him everything in the right order. I gave him what I had: dates, names, language used in meetings. The specific section we had been told was retained, and the specific section that had subsequently been removed from the agency maps. Aldrich listened and asked questions and wrote things down. He was not a man I liked particularly. He had the quality of someone who managed situations rather than solving them, who was calculating risks alongside his responses. But he was not crooked. That much I could feel. He was a man who understood that something had been done wrong and was working out what that meant for him professionally and personally, and who had enough decency to let the personal version of that reckoning pull him toward the right side of the professional one. There was a moment, about halfway through, when he asked about the specific meeting at which the land retention had been communicated to me. He wanted dates, the name of the agency representative, the specific language used. I gave him all of it. I had kept those details not on paper but in the particular place in memory where I kept things I could not afford to lose, the same place I kept the faces of the 3 men I didn't bring home. There is a way of holding something in memory that is different from simply remembering it. You put it somewhere deliberate, and you return to it regularly, not to grieve over it but to make sure it's still sharp. The dates were sharp, the name was sharp. The specific words, the phrasing of the commitment, the way the agent had touched the map with his finger on the northeastern section and said this remains with your people. We are clear on that, all of it sharp. Aldrich stopped writing for a moment when I got to that part. He looked up at me. I held his look, and I did not soften it or look away or give him anything that would let him file me in a category that was easier to dismiss. I just held it and let him see that I was a man who had been lied to in a deliberate and documented way, and who had ridden 10 days to sit in his office and say so. He went back to writing. At the end of it, he said he would open a formal inquiry. He said it in the way men say things when they mean it, carefully, not with the brightness of someone making a promise they'll forget. He also said that the report Nora Voss had brought would need to be authenticated against the copy submitted to the Washington office 2 years ago, and that he expected that authentication to take no longer than 2 weeks, and that we would receive written confirmation of the inquiry's opening at an address of our choosing. Nora Voss gave him her sister's address in Ohio. I gave him the agency address, care of the agent himself, which was a deliberate choice. I wanted the agent to see that mail arriving. I wanted him to know what was in Cheyenne. Nora Voss said, and the individual named in the report. Aldrich said he couldn't discuss ongoing personnel matters. She said that was not an answer to her question. He said that individuals connected to fraudulent federal land allocations were subject to federal jurisdiction. She said that was closer. She had a quality in that room that I found myself watching, the way she pressed without raising her voice, the way she held her ground without making it a confrontation. She was not performing toughness. She was just not moving. In 30 years of dealing with people who had power over things I cared about, I had watched many people try to hold ground in rooms like that one, and most of them failed because they were working too hard at it. You could see the effort, which gave the other person something to work against. Nora Voss didn't give him anything to work against. She simply remained where she was, looking at him, waiting for the answer she'd asked for. After a moment, Aldrich said, "The individual named will be contacted as part of the inquiry process." She said, "That is what I needed to hear." And she meant it. She wasn't being sarcastic. She was genuinely acknowledging that that was the minimum she'd come for and she'd gotten it. She stood up, picked up the copy of her husband's report that she'd set on the edge of Aldrich's desk at the start of the meeting, folded it once, and put it back inside her coat. She had not left him the original. He'd asked. She'd said she would forward a second copy once the inquiry was formally open, and she had confirmation in writing. He'd looked at her for a moment and then he'd agreed, because he understood that she was a woman who had spent the past 2 years carrying a document that men had tried to kill her for, and that she was not going to hand the only copy over to someone she'd met an hour ago on the strength of a verbal agreement. I had not thought about that. She'd thought about it. When we came out into the street, I stood in the cold air for a moment and Chayton looked at me, and I nodded at him, which was enough. We stayed in Cheyenne 2 nights. It was the practical thing. The horses needed rest. The men needed a proper meal, and Aldrich had asked us to remain in case he had follow-up questions, which he did briefly on the second morning. I don't love cities. I never have. There's a particular texture of noise in them that I find grating after a while, not loud, exactly, but layered, everything on top of everything else, no space for quiet to settle. I walked to the edge of the city on the first evening, to where the buildings gave out and the land opened up again to the east, and I stood there until the light went. Nora Voss found me there. She came and stood beside me, a few feet away, looking east. She had bought herself a coat at a dry goods store that afternoon, a plain brown wool coat, and she had her hands in the pockets and her breath showed in the cold air. After a while she said, "What happens when you go back?" I said, "The agent wants me at the agency before the month's end." She said, "And will you go?" I thought about it. I said, "I'll go. I'll go because if I don't go, he has a reason to send someone and I don't want that kind of attention on my people right now." I paused. "But I'll go differently than I would have 2 weeks ago." She turned and looked at me. "Differently how?" I said, 2 weeks ago I would have gone trying to keep everything from getting worse. Now I'm going to go and make a record. Every meeting, every commitment, every discrepancy between what I'm told and what happens afterward, the same way your husband did." She looked at me for a long moment, something in her face that I couldn't entirely read. She said, "He would have liked that." I said, "What was he like?" And she told me. Not the surveyor, not the man with the report, but the man himself, a methodical man, she said. A man who fixed things rather than talking about fixing them, who had a specific way of holding his coffee cup in the morning with both hands as if he were warming the whole of himself by it, who had been honest to a fault his whole life, because he'd been raised to believe that the cost of dishonesty was your own self-respect, and he couldn't afford that cost. I listened to all of it. The light was going to the west, and the cold was settling in, and I listened to her talk about a man she had loved and lost, and I thought about the kind of man who does the right thing in a situation where the wrong thing is easier and safer, and I thought about how rare that was, and how the world ought to do better by such men than it usually does. When she was done, she was quiet for a while. Then she said, "What was your wife like?" I said, "She died 8 years ago." She said, "I'm sorry." I said, "She was the kind of woman who made a camp feel like a home no matter where it was. That sounds like a small thing. It isn't." Nora Voss said, "No, it isn't." We stood there in the cold until the last of the light was gone. In the morning we split our roads. She was going east, on to a sister's house in Ohio, and from there she'd written to her husband's contacts in Washington, men who'd known about the report, who'd expected the follow-up that never came. She had more work to do. I could see it in how she stood, not done, just paused. There was a quality of forward motion in her even at rest. My men had the horses packed and ready. I stood by my horse and watched Chayton check the ties on the gear and thought about the road north and the agent's office and all the careful, wearing work that waited there. Nora Voss came and stood in front of me. She said, "I want to say something and I want to say it plainly." I said, "All right." She said, "You pulled me out of a hole and fed me and sheltered me and rode 10 days out of your way into a city you didn't want to be in and stood in a government office and said the things that needed saying. You did that when you didn't have to, when it cost you time and attention and probably goodwill with the agency, when most men would have left me at the bottom of that cistern because it was someone else's problem." She stopped. She looked at me directly the way she looked at everything, squarely, without flinching. She said, "There aren't many men like that. Your wife was right to make a home for you, and those 26 people are right to follow you." I didn't say anything for a moment. She reached out and put her hand on my arm, briefly, a plain gesture, nothing performed about it. Just a hand on an arm, the weight of it real. She said, "You're a good man, Lakota." I said, "Go safe, Nora Voss." She nodded. Then she went to the wagon that the livery stable had rented her, climbed up, and clicked to the horse, and I watched her go east down the street until she turned a corner and was gone. The road north took us 6 days. We made a camp the last night in the cottonwoods, the same cottonwoods, the same stand by the creek, and I sat by the fire and listened to the horses and the creek and the way those two sounds mixed together, which is a sound I have been listening to my whole life. Chayton was still awake across the fire. He said, "Do you think the inquiry will do anything?" I said I didn't know. He said, but you think it might. I thought about Aldrich's face in that office, the way he'd written things down, the way a man writes things down when he intends to do something with what he's writing. I said, yes, I think it might. Chayton nodded slowly. He looked into the fire. He was quiet for a minute and then he said, she was something, that woman. I said, yes, she was. He said, the way she talked in that office. He shook his head, like she'd been planning it her whole life. I said she had been. 7 days in a hole gave her a lot of time to plan. He was quiet, then he said, are you glad we went? I sat with that. The fire was burning down to coals, and the creek ran, and the horses shifted in the dark, and overhead the stars were out in the way they get this far from any town, thick and cold, and so many of them that the darkness between them looks thin. I said, I'm glad we went. He nodded, said nothing more, lay down after a while and was asleep. I sat there by the coals for a long time. I thought about the 400 acres. I thought about whether Aldrich's inquiry would reach the right hands, would be taken seriously, would result in anything that resembled justice. I thought about the land agent in Silver City and what kind of morning he was having this week, whether he knew yet what was in Cheyenne waiting for him, and the particular satisfaction of knowing a man like that was having to wonder. I thought about my wife, the way she made a camp feel like a home. I had not thought about her much lately, not from forgetting, but from the kind of deliberate not thinking that you do when a thing is too sharp to handle regularly. Nora Voss had loosened something there, asked me a question no one had asked me in years. I thought about Nora Voss. On the road east, sitting up straight in that rented wagon, with a coal going cold in her coat lining that had her husband's careful words on it, that she had carried for 2 years through everything, that she had not let go of when they lowered her into the dark. There are people who hold on to things because they can't let go, and there are people who hold on to things because they know exactly what the thing is worth and they've decided it's worth the cost. Nora Voss knew the cost. She had paid it in a dry stone hole for 7 days and she had come out the other side and kept paying it. That was not stubbornness. That was a clear-eyed decision made every single day. This thing matters enough. Martin Voss had known what was right and done it, and it had cost him everything. His wife knew what was right and was doing it still, carrying his work forward across the same country that had tried to bury both of them in it. I was trying to be that kind of man. Had tried most of my life and succeeded more than I'd failed, and still managed to find myself tired and worn down and feeling those last few years that the trying wasn't landing anywhere, that it was pouring into sand, that the sand would take everything I poured into it and show nothing at the surface. But the sand does take it. That's the thing. It takes it down and holds it, and what looks like nothing is not nothing, it's just not visible yet. A surveyor's report sits at the bottom of a filing cabinet in Washington for 2 years and looks like nothing, and then a woman sews it into her coat and rides into a government office, and it becomes the thing that opens an inquiry that becomes the thing that costs a land agent in Silver City a great deal more than he planned. The record matters. The record always mattered. Martin Voss understood that, and I had understood it once too, before I got tired, before the tired made everything feel like pouring into sand. She had given that back to me, this woman I'd never met before and would probably not see again. Not with a speech, not with an argument. She hadn't tried to convince me of anything. She had just done the thing she came to do, right in front of me, and let me watch. And watching it, I had remembered what it felt like to believe the doing mattered. And she had put her hand on my arm and said, "You are a good man," plain and direct and without wanting anything back from it. I sat with that a while longer. The coals were going to orange and gray. I was going to go to the agency at the end of the week. I was going to sit across from the agent, and I was going to say what needed saying, and I was going to write down what he said, and I was going to do it again the next time and the time after that. I was going to start keeping a record the way Martin Voss had kept a record, the way water builds a canyon, slow and patient and never stopping, and in the end the water is still there, and the canyon is the proof of it. Not the proof that the water won. The proof that it was there, that it persisted, that it carved something real into the stone of the world and left the shape of its passing. That was enough for tonight. I lay down and pulled the blanket up and listened to the creek and the horses, and the cottonwood leaves that were still left on the branches made their dry paper sound in the wind, and I slept the first real sleep I'd had in I don't know how long. In the morning the sky was clear and cold and pale at the edges in the east where the light was coming, and the horses were stamping and the creek was steady, and I got up and got the fire going and put the coffee on. And Chayton woke to the smell of it and sat up and looked at me, and I handed him a cup, and he took it with both hands. We had work to do, good work, the kind a man can stand behind. That was enough.